Well, welcome, everyone. John Henry, the chairman of the Committee for the Republic. The mission of the Committee for the Republic is to bring American citizens of all political persuasions together to discuss issues of vital importance to the nation. The pandemic, as you know, is in a category all its own. Is science dictating policy, as we are told? Once again, our Congress is missing in action. Congress has abdicated its responsibility to publicly receive and digest diverse expert viewpoints and has surrendered its authority over the response to the executive branch, which operates with transparency and directs officials to speak with one voice. The Committee for the Republic will hold COVID salons to examine both majority and dissenting opinions of the science and the policy. Since policy should be based on science, the committee begins tonight with science. This salon will address the science of a dissenting view. Our second salon will host a science advocating the prevailing. I encourage you to send in your suggestions for that speaker. We will collect that and pick that speaker at a later date. I encourage you, subsequent salons will address other views and examine their implications for policy. As you know, the committee does not endorse any particular scientific view or policy. The committee's objective is simply to provide a platform welcoming various views to enrich public deliberations and decisions to defeat the pandemic. Each of us as citizens has a duty to reach independent and informed judgments. Tonight is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Knut M. Wittkowski. Knut earned an MS in biostatistics and a double PhD in computer sciences and medical biometry, which is physiology, epidemiology, and genetics at the University of Göttingen, Stuttgart, and Tübingen in Germany. He worked for more than a decade with Dr. Klaus Dietz, the epidemiologist who established the landmark relationship between infectiousness, the so-called basic reproduction number, and herd immunity. For 2 decades, Knut headed biostatistics, epidemiology, and research design at Rockefeller University. Since then, he's been CEO of Astera that, based on his research, develops products against age-related ailments, including viral diseases. Knut is working on a product that he believes will dramatically slow the uptake of viruses in our cells. Tonight's speaker is rare in his willingness to challenge orthodoxies, notwithstanding short-term professional reputation. In the 1990s, Knut challenged the orthodoxy in Germany that HIV would spread among Caucasian heterosexuals. He was proven right. Knut signed the Great Barrington Resolution, and that, if you're not aware, is the resolution that came out in September, where many scientists call for selective rather than universal mitigation to defeat the pandemic. Knut signed the Great Barrington Statement this September, but he was on record 6 months before that, calling for selective mitigation to save lives rather than universal mitigation. Knut was also among the first scientists to see the implications of the new escape mutation COVID strains. As John Stuart Mill elaborated on liberty, dissenters are twice blessed. They may lead to the discovery of truths and the overthrow of falsehoods. And even if they err, they sharpen our understanding and confidence of the ideas that have withstood challenge. Knut's talk tonight will be divided into 2 parts. He would like to first make 3 basic points about epidemiology, and then we'll take several questions. Then for the second part of his talk, Knut will make 4 points relating to relating the science to the policy, and we will open up for a general conversation. So I would appreciate if you would submit your questions on chat so that we can be more organized and call on you. So Knut, it's all yours.
John, thank you very much for inviting me. First thing is, can you hear my voice well?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, then I would like to make another introductory remark. I will not speak for all dissenting people because dissenting people have typically different points, and I will only speak for points that I would like to make. So after that introduction, I would start talking about the controversial issue of herd immunity. It has become controversial for an epidemiologist that I'm trained in only in the last couple of weeks. Until then, it was well established that all respiratory virus diseases end by herd immunity. We had 200 of them about over the last 100 years only, and each and every of them ended by herd immunity. We can accelerate herd immunity a bit by vaccination, but in the end, it is herd immunity that ends an epidemic. So this is what the natural end, and this is where we can go to either by slowing it down, hastening it, but there is no other end to an epidemic. So that is to state something that is one of the things that I believe is universally accepted among epidemiologists, but as with everything we say, that somebody else may have a different opinion, and that is fine because science lives by people having different opinions. That is what makes it different from religions or other areas where one person tells what's right or one government and everybody has to follow. In science and in a democracy, there should be an open discussion that in the end will improve whatever the situation is and what we think about it. So to get to herd immunity, we have to have immunity. When we are confronted with the virus, we are getting infected, we develop with all of these respiratory virus diseases, we develop immunity. And because viruses can mutate, we develop more than one antibody against every virus that we are confronting. So if that virus should mutate, then our immunity will still be sufficient to block that virus from spreading and to kill all cells that are infected with that virus. So immunity that we developed is always polyclonal. There are 5 or 6 different antibodies that we develop with every disease that we are confronting. And evolution has told us that that is enough during the typical course of an epidemic. There are never more than 2 or 3 different clones that develop. So if we have antibodies against 6 of them, that is enough for the course of an epidemic that typically lasts between 4 and 6 weeks, could be a week more or a week less. So that is the polyclonal immunity that we develop. A problem arises if we do lockdowns. Lockdowns flatten the curve. And in March, as you may remember, lockdowns were started because there was a fear that after what we had seen in Italy, something similar might happen in the United States. and in other countries. And that is that the whole health system might collapse because of too many cases with COVID. In fact, it never collapsed. In New York, the epicenter of the epidemic in the United States, there was a hospital ship that was never used. They created a field hospital in the Javits Conference Center. It was never really used. And Mount Sinai put up several dozens of tents in Central Park as to treat all the people that they were afraid might come, but they didn't come. So, and then on April the 17th, Robert Redfield presented data in the White House showing that the epidemic of people coming into hospitals had peaked in mid-March. So the epidemic of infections must have peaked very early on in March, long before the lockdowns started. And when the lockdowns started, the new infections were already way down. So herd immunity had conquered this disease like many other diseases. Nature's evolution had proven to be effective. This disease had been conquered by nature developing herd immunity like with every other respiratory virus disease. So now if we are slowing down the spread of a disease that might prevent hospitals from overflowing, but it comes at a price. It gives the virus more time to mutate. So these viruses mutate at a rate about 1 or 2 mutations a month. So within 6 months, or even a bit less, that would be enough for viruses to develop escape strains. So they develop one after the other mutation to counteract, to avoid, to evade the antibodies our immune system has developed. And once all or most of these antibodies have been rendered ineffective, we have an escape strain that spreads and can spread again exactly the way as a new virus. And initially that was a theory. But then in October, the data from Spain and France that had been collected in Europe and where different people had been sequenced showed that this actually had happened twice in Spain and in France. Virus clones had developed so many mutations, escape mutations, that they were able to spread again exactly like the viruses before that came here early on via Wuhan and Milano. And so in October, November, we had another wave of COVID cases that were caused by these strains that had evaded natural immunity. And then there were others. There was another strain in South Africa, and then there was a somewhat unusual strain more recently in the UK. So this is something that is now proven to happen over and over again on a regular basis. This single strand RNA virus is capable of mutating a lot and enough to evade natural immunity and most likely also the immunity that is created artificially by vaccines to mimic the natural immunity. So whenever we're having a lockdown and slowing down the spread of a disease, prolonging it, not reducing the number of cases, but prolonging the time during which these cases are developed, what we are seeing is we incubate strains that are immune or resistant, that escape human immunity, and then we have the next epidemic. So these are the very basic facts that we have to keep in mind when we are thinking about what the best strategies should be to fight such a disease. And I would like to stop here for a moment to give everybody the opportunity to ask questions so that we can discuss this, because I'm not somebody to just state what you have to believe. I want to convince and explain it so that we agree or have at least some common understanding that will allow us to think about what are the strategies that one should follow based on that science. John? Hello? Hello?
Okay, I'm sorry. Frank Gambino has a question. Max, can you identify Frank here? He has a question on herd immunity. I can read it. He says, do respiratory viruses ever cease to exist? Does herd immunity lead to the complete eradication of the virus? How much longer does a lockdown allow a virus to exist? So he's asked several questions there.
Okay, with every respiratory disease, viruses that are new epidemics, and the endemic flu, colds are a different category. They follow a different dynamic. But we had, like this flu season, we had 3 different epidemics. We had an influenza B epidemic where the cases peaked in late December. We had an influenza A epidemic in early February. And then, as I mentioned, we had the COVID epidemic in mid-March. So all of these epidemics end through natural herd immunity. We can accelerate that a bit with vaccines, if we have some, although most of the time they're not very effective, or we can prolong it. And what we have seen, there are very few regions where we can see an effect of the lockdowns, because mostly the lockdowns came too late. One of the exceptions is the south of the United States, where the lockdown started before the virus arrived. And then, as you may remember, when the lockdowns were finally ended, more or less, or at least ameliorated, we had a new wave of the delayed infections and the delayed hospitalizations and death in August. John? Hello?
John, you're muted again.
Yeah, okay. Let me see here. Monique has a question about your strategy, which you'll get into in the second part of your talk.
Yeah.
There's a question here. I'm trying to, it's a long one, from someone saying, yeah, why are you the only one?
Want me to unmute him?
Yeah, I can't read. It says, Max, it's jumping around on me here. As far as I know, you're the only one expressing this hypothesis, hypothesis that the virus mutated into something new enough to reboot the pandemic. Why is this the case that no other orthodox, why are not other epidemiologists discussing this?
Well, the first is I've read this now several times, even in the media. So this is not something anymore where I'm standing alone. It is a very well established concept And it's consistent with what people were proposing in the Great Barrington Declaration, which has now been signed by, I think, about 1 million people and about 100,000 health professionals and scientists. So I don't see that I am standing alone. It is just that it's something that the politicians don't want to hear. And I have experienced that even my former university has distanced itself because they were afraid that their NIH funding might be compromised if somebody issues an opinion that is diverse from what the NIH says. So most scientists are dependent on NIH money, and if the NIH says that doesn't exist, then people are very reluctant to confront the NIH at the risk of losing their funding.
Judy and Ken Shoemaker, I see you have a herd immunity question here about, Max, can you unmute them? Yeah, go ahead. If you
My
can-
question simply is that now that we have so many mutations, is natural herd immunity still viable?
Natural immunity, the ability for us to become immune against all sorts of viruses, has evolved over millions of years. So yes, the natural immunity will help us for quite a number of cycles, although eventually it will become a bit more difficult, probably. But we have never seen that. We have never seen what happens if we mitigate several phases of immunity, because this is the first time that humans have intervened with natural immunity.
Thank you.
Okay, I see Tim Worth has a question on the Swedish, on Sweden and their the approach that they took on the first wave.
So Sweden made the same mistake.
Tim, you
Sweden
want to?
made the same mistake as the United States and Britain, and that is that they were not as effective as South Korea in isolating the nursing homes. In South Korea, they simply locked the doors and the personnel had to stay there, locked in, and nobody was allowed to get out and then back in. In the United States, infectious seniors were sent back into the nursing homes so that they could infect other seniors. In Sweden, the situation was also very open. So in both countries, with very similar results, a lot of the seniors in nursing home dies. The only difference is that in Sweden, it was acknowledged that that was a mistake. In the United States, politicians find it a bit more difficult to acknowledge that they made a mistake.
Okay, we need to move on to the next section. I'll take one more question. I see Nancy Greenspan. Max, can you, Nancy? You're asking about the Spanish flu, because that hit in 1918 and it came back in 1919. Was that a mutant, or was that can you explain that?
Well, it's very difficult to explain what happened exactly in 1918, 1919, because the viruses were not genotyped. So we don't know exactly what happened. But what happened then was, it was the first time that humans created a worldwide, very exceptional situation where people were put at risk, at high risk, where there was quite some delay. And that was all related to World War I, which then led to the Great Depression. And what we have right now is the second time in the history of humans that politics have created such a disaster that the normal function of herd immunity was interrupted.
Okay, good. We've got a lot more questions, but I think we can get to those in the next section. So why don't we move on now, Knut, to your second part of your presentation.
Okay, I would like to talk about 4 pillars of interventions, how to fight such respiratory virus disease. The first is, and that was something that was said, for instance, very early on in Germany by the Leopoldina, the Scientific Advisory Committee to the German government, that also I published end of March, and is now a key point of the Great Barrington Declaration. It is that schools and businesses should remain open. The shutdown does nothing beneficial unless preventing hospitals from the hospital system from collapsing, if that ever should be a risk. Other than that, it only creates problems, and the major problem created by lockdowns is that we are incubating resistant strains, which is the normal process, how a virus reacts to an environmental pressure. And then evolution helps the virus to overcome that pressure. So with the lockdowns, we are forcing almost the virus to mutate and to develop escape mutations. So on the other hand, also consistent with the Great Barrington Declaration, is we should allow and assist vulnerable people, including vulnerable seniors, to self-isolate. So if they say they want to stay home, and we should make sure they get their meals delivered, they get their their dry cleaning picked up, all of these services. If somebody is asking for these services, that should be provided. Compared to what a lockdown is costing, providing a couple more taxi rides to seniors is a drop in the bucket. It doesn't even show up on the scale anymore. So we should help them to self-isolate. We should also make sure that they have available masks to wear, whatever effective they are. I don't want to go there because that's still an open question. And of course, the people interacting with them directly, helping them to get from the chair, the wheelchair into the bed or other functions, they should also wear masks, because we want to do everything to prevent the virus from spreading among the vulnerable, where virus infections cause severe illness and often death. So the first thing was keep the schools and the economy open. The second point is allow seniors and vulnerable people to self-isolate. So then, of course, if we have vaccines and they are effective, then let's use the vaccines. There's nothing wrong fundamentally with vaccines. They speed up the developing of herd immunity, and that is good. The only thing we should not do is to have vaccines and mitigation at the same time. One strategy speeds up the development of herd immunity. The other strategy slows it down. This is like you're driving a car and hitting the gas while also hitting the gas, the brakes. So it simply does not make any sense. I don't know where the ideas come from, but the problem is there is no discussion, and that's why this evening here has been organized. There is no discussion between politicians and independent scientists. Politicians only discuss with the scientists they pay and tell implicitly or explicitly what they would like to hear. So that discussion hasn't taken place, but that would be very disadvantageous to do two opposing strategies at the same time. Now, the fourth pillar is that we actually can, aside from treatments that should be developed if they can, and we will see whether treatments will ever become available, because we don't really have a lot of good treatments against virus diseases, any of them, with the exception of hepatitis C, but we can act earlier. One thing is we can, and now I'm talking about something I'm involved in because my company, Astera, is producing an intervention that would do that, but other companies should do the same, try the same thing, and there should be a healthy competition. We should first try to reduce comorbidities like metabolic syndrome or being obese, having type 2 diabetes, having high LDL and low HDL and other symptoms or conditions. Because if you don't have a comorbidity, even if you're old, like Prince Charles or our president, you don't die. And even Christie, who definitely has a comorbidity, but even he survived. So, but if you have several of them, then you are at a risk of dying. And so we should try to intervene and prevent people from, or reduce their comorbidities so that they are more fit to deal with the illness. And the second thing we could do and can do, I think, is to reduce the replication of the virus. Because we are not really, the virus doesn't kill us. We could live with that virus forever. However, after the 1-week incubation period, when the immune system finally has antibodies to recognize the virus, and we were talking about that earlier, if the immune system has these antibodies, the antibodies are marking all the cells that have been infected, and then the immune system kills all these cells. And if there were a lot of cells, then we have a huge wound in our lungs, in our blood vessels, wherever else. And it is that wound that's killing us. If we are old and if we have comorbidities, then we cannot cope with such a huge wound in our body. So one of the most effective strategies to prevent death is to reduce the replication of the virus. Now, each virus replication has a cycle that lasts about 7 hours during these 5 days. And if we are reducing the replication of the virus only by 10% during each of these 7-hour replication cycles, we have reduced the overall amount of virus and the overall amount of cells that get infected by a factor of 80 to 90%. And if we have only 10 or 20% as many cells that need to be killed by our immune system, we have a much smaller wound and we are much less likely to die. So the combination of reducing comorbidities and reducing the replication of the virus is something that we would expect to be highly effective in preventing death. And it could be easily done. The only caveat is we have to start before we have the symptoms. So people have to start that prevention. And that's why we need something that is extremely safe. People have talked about hydrochloroquine or other drugs. Ivermectin. Ivermectin is the new drug. All of these drugs, these anti-parasite drugs, for instance, they're designed to be used for a very short period of time. But if you take them over weeks or even months, then you have to you're expecting adverse events, and that is not good if people have to take it who may never get ill. So we need something that is extremely safe, and I think there are alternatives, and that's what we are working on. And we are ready to bring that to the market, but that needs a commercial structure, and we have to develop that commercial structure.
Okay, are you finished with the 4 points now? We'll open up.
These were the 4 points.
Okay, great. I see Hugh Hill has a question about mutations. Max, can you unmute Hugh? Or do you want me to read it?
I've asked him to unmute.
So I can speak if you'll allow it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So Knut, what do you think the result of the mutations are? Do you think they're dangerous or not?
The virus is unlikely to become more deadly. Viruses have no advantage from killing the host. So the viruses that leave the host alive and happy are replicated more, spread more. And so it is very unlikely that a virus gets more deadly.
So that's consistent with my understanding of what the majority scientific opinion says. And so
anything I said is contradicting what other scientists say. There are different variations, but what I laid out in the very beginning, I really think has a broad consensus.
well, it's not a broad consensus in this way. The escape mutations are not thought to be inherently dangerous.
No, they're
Most
not.
of them,
They're not inherently dangerous. I didn't say that. They just allow the virus to spread again.
so if the virus is contained by vaccination and by infection, tell me what the effect of that is.
Okay, the virus is contained by antibodies.
Well,
And
but I'm sorry. Let me just interrupt for a minute because I just got vaccinated 2 days ago, and I'm very excited about that. I
you
don't
will
know.
have antibodies in a couple of days.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to hear that. So my antibodies, we don't know yet the extent to which they will block me or sterilize me from getting an infection. I mean, we know that they will, that the vaccination will keep me from getting terribly sick and dying in a hospital, high percentage probability. But the infection is still possible, and I could still get infected and spread it to family and friends.
Okay, let me clarify this.
Okay, please.
Vaccinated people, immune people, get infected at the same rate as other people. Vaccination does not prevent infection. It prevents illness. So if you are vaccinated, if you have the antibodies, if you get infected, your body has antibodies to bind these viruses within the first cycle of replication or even earlier. And so there will never be a broad spread of the virus inside of your body, and therefore you will never get ill, but you will get infected.
I hope you're right, because
that's how it works.
Well, the preliminary data that I've seen suggests that the prevention of severe cases, it runs in the 96% rate. By the way, I got the Moderna vaccine, and the prevention of infection may be only in the 60%. So I could still get,
okay.
Wait,
the vaccine does not.
Let me finish, please. I could still get infected and
Yes.
spread it to other people. So I'm still wearing
No.
masks and protecting my family.
Okay, let me answer. You can still get infected, but it's virtually impossible for you to spread the virus, because if you have antibodies already ready, you will not develop enough progeny of viruses to eventually spread them. Your immune system will kill or eliminate these viruses very early on before this exponential increase in viruses can happen.
I hope you're right, but I appreciate.
It's biology.
No, let me finish. Thank you. I let you, so let me.
Yeah, sure.
I appreciate that you are open to the fact that we don't have enough data to say a lot of conclusions about a lot of things. And I don't know if the immunity I get from that vaccine will be blocking or sterilizing, and if so, for how long?
We don't know if it works for 1 year or 2 years. That's true. That's true. However, if we have seen that the vaccine prevents illness, and if it prevents illness, it does so by preventing early on the replication of the virus. And if you're not replicating the virus, you cannot spread it.
So would you please tie that back in with your thesis that we should let the virus, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but let the virus go amongst the younger people?
This has nothing to do with the vaccine. We were talking about the mechanism by which vaccines work. This is very different from how infection works, although in the end, the result is similar. The body is capable of making antibodies. So the body will be prepared for the next infection. The difference is with the vaccine or with the strategy that we are developing, you are preventing one course of an infection that is uninhibited. So if it goes through children, the initial infection will be uninhibited. Although in children, because of their innate immune system and their preparedness to be confronted with the viruses, virus infections typically are very mild, at least for these viruses, are very mild, often asymptomatic, and we have seen virtually no children without comorbidities dying in the United States from COVID.
So I
I think there were 25.
I could disagree with a lot of that, John, but Knut and I are kind of taking too much time here. We want to let your rest of your folks talk.
Well, yeah, we can come back. So have we addressed? Hugh brought up the opening the schools. Did you finish on that, Knut, or on the opening the schools? I mean, first we didn't open the schools in the spring. We shut them down, and this time we now Fauci's changed his position on the schools.
I'm not surprised. There was never a reason to shut down schools because it was known even before the virus came here that children deal with that virus without having too many problems, that it's the 50% of all people who die are people who are 80 years and older. The number of children who die, I think last time I looked, it was 25 children below the age of 14 in the United States who died. It may have increased by a few. I haven't looked last week or so, but we are talking in the same time, there were 50 children who died of influenza. The number of children who die of COVID is negligible. It's tragic for the families where it happens, but from a perspective of the epidemic, it is a minor point.
Okay, Monique, you had a question. Monique?
Okay, I'm mute, right? Yes, my last question was, I didn't read much about the vaccines that came out. So I know about animals. Being a veterinarian, we do have a lot of modified live virus. And after being vaccinated, the dogs are shedding those virus for a short time. So those vaccines that they have created for the COVID, they are not modified live viruses, are they?
No, only in China.
Okay. That was my question, because I didn't read any of that. And
No, there is no spread of the vaccine.
Traditionally,
It's impossible.
the usual way to make a vaccine is to attenuate it and then give it to people and hope they develop an immune response. This goes all the way back to Pasteur and rabies.
Right.
These first two vaccines we have with Moderna and Pfizer are very different from that.
they're not modified. They're not attenuated, right? That's what you said.
No, you take just a short piece of the virus genome, you put it into an adenovirus or another body. So you're elucidating an immune response, but the person gets never inoculated with a complete virus.
Okay.
The AstraZeneca vaccine from England uses the adenovirus that he's talking about. The others just like go directly to your lymph nodes and start generating immunoglobulins.
Okay, I see Tim Worth has a question here. Tim?
Can you?
He needs to be unmuted.
I'm trying to unmute.
I can hear him.
There we go. Can you address the strategy that you think Biden should pursue in terms of who gets what vaccine and what's the most efficacious order for the public presentation? It seems to me that as more people catch on, there's a real possibility here of a mad kind of undisciplined scramble to get vaccinated, and there ought to be, I think, some clearer understanding than I currently have as to what are the priorities that the administration ought to be pursuing.
What a great question, and it should be addressed by all of you and not by Knut and me, because you are the policy folks. The committee, after the Pfizer vaccine approval for a couple of weeks ago, backed away within a couple of days and said, "Oh my God, you're right. We're going to cause 300,000 extra deaths amongst the old folks if we don't include them in the first tranche." So I got my vaccine because I'm an emergency provider and I'm exposed to COVID more than 16 hours a week. But you could make the argument, as they do in Europe, that the people that are going to be more likely to die should be first. Right now, what we've done in America, as we often do in this kind of situation, is we've quibbled and we've said both are the same tranche. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that doesn't you were the guys that think about this day in and day out, and you know, it seems to me that you have a responsibility to try to say to people, this is your best judgment as to what ought to be done. I mean, the reason that it's not being given, you know, to the public is that maybe people, you know, can't decide. I appreciate your long discussion earlier. I don't understand why you don't have a view as to the priorities that ought to be set on this. Or maybe you do, and you just don't want to tell us what it is.
I do have a view, and because my facility is being overwhelmed with sick COVID patients, I want facilities and providers in those facilities to be first. But my answer is clearly biased, and you, as a policy decider who thinks about the economics and stuff over all about that, should be answering that instead of me.
Okay, Knut, do you want to jump in here?
We have two objectives. One objective is to reduce the number of immediate deaths. And that would mean we have to vaccinate the people who are 80 years or older and have comorbidities. The other thing is we have to keep our hospital system running. And if we get infections among the personnel and the personnel self-isolates, then suddenly we have the hospitals, but nobody to actually care for patients in the hospitals. So that is a very difficult decision. And I haven't done the math to calculate which of the strategies might be more effective. I can see pros and cons for both of them.
Well, going to his question, if I were trying to figure this out, I think I'd start obviously with the medical professionals first and foremost, and then look at, see where is the greatest economic bang for the immunization. And that's going to be, it seems to me, older people right away, people who are in nursing homes and sick. So you're not loading down the hospital system and the medical care system. And you're going to get a lot more result from immunizing older people much more quickly, and then move down from there. I see that, you know, Texas and Florida have decided to do exactly that, or as I remember what they've decided to do.
Okay.
Maybe Knut, we agree on that. I don't.
As I said, you can argue for one or the other. I haven't done the economic or other calculations, so I cannot. I don't have an opinion which of the two strategies should be favored.
So, there are a number of questions on the two first vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna, use this novel RNA technology. Can you address that? There are a number of questions on that.
I think there are better people to address that question than I.
All right.
John, can I just say that I think Knut will agree with me that the mRNA technology is the result of years of research that have been done about this. And this speaks to how we should plan to prepare for the next one, which is maybe going to be worse than this.
Well, if we want to look towards the next one, we should stop mitigation. We should stop the lockdowns. We should stop masking for the general population. All of these strategies have the aim to flatten the curve, and flattening the curve leads to the incubation of new resistant strains that cause the next epidemic.
So that's great. I appreciate that because it gets to the essence of the distinction between Dr. Wittkowski's arguments and that of the majority of scientists. And it speaks to what we should nod your head. You know that's true. The majority of scientists say otherwise, and the clinicians of various sorts say otherwise. And it speaks to what this group, which is influential in Washington, should take away from this about in thinking about what we should do in planning for the next one. Further to
we have seen that Spain was the country that had the most draconian lockdowns in Europe. And it was, and I would say not by coincidence, that the first resistant strain in Europe was incubated in Spain. I would not make that point as pointedly if we wouldn't have now several examples where we have seen this virus develop escape mutations that are causing new waves, new epidemics. And once we have seen that, we should consider this in our deliberations. And
so let me respond by saying that most changes in the base pairings of the RNA of the virus result in dead ends. They don't go anywhere. And I've talked with Dr. Wittkowski about this before, and he agrees with me. But the virologist, and I'm not a virologist, virologists say it's not a mutation unless it changes the phenotype or the effect of the virus. So
yeah,
there's
I
a question
understand
about-
the view of the virologist here. But if the antibodies bind against a non-functional region of the virus, then the mutations in that non-functional epitope can make the antibody useless, but it will have no difference in the function of the virus.
So that,
escape mutations can have an impact, an effect on the distribution, on the epidemic, and without changing the function of the virus. And that's a great difference between a virologist and an epidemiologist.
so and a statistician. So can is to be agreed with, but I think for this audience, you ought to explain a little more about what you mean and define epitopes, for example.
An epitope is a piece of the genome of the virus that is recognized by antibodies. So the antibodies can bind, and if an antibody on the exprimed part of the virus, and if the antibody binds there, then the killer T cells come and kill the cell.
So what we're worried about is the spike proteins, right?
No, they're not.
We're not worried about the spike?
The problem, or what we want to do, is to have antibodies that bind somewhere against the genome of the virus so that the killer cells can kill all the infected cells and stop the replication of the virus.
Yeah.
So
It's not necessarily something that has to be in the spike protein. The spike protein is responsible for the binding. But here we are not talking about inhibiting the binding. We're talking about cells exhibiting viral genome if they realize that they're being infected. And then there are antibodies that are trying to bind against that piece of the genome to identify the cells that are infected and kill the cells. That happens way after the virus has bound to the ACE2 receptor or whatever it is and being incorporated. So there is no reason to target these epitopes.
So yes,
Knut,
you're
maybe-
right, it's an ACE2 inhibitor. And I've got to sign off soon, but I wanted to say thank you for doing this. And you know, this is the kind of discussion we need to be having. And thank you. And I hope that the audience has had a chance to get their questions in. If they don't, ask later, and Knut and I will get after it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Knut, I think people don't really understand the science that is in my understanding, and if you can go into this in some detail, that even though we invented sequencing, that these sequences of these viruses has only been around for about a year, and Europe is way ahead of us. England's doing half of them, and there are all these science papers that have come out in the last couple months that you were very early on. And why don't you explain why we're so far behind? You know, we're talking about testing, but the most fundamental kind of testing is to know where these mutations, where are they coming from, what they are, what makes an escape mutation, what makes it down, why it's a down mutation. Can you explain, give a little more background, because I think people need to hear the background.
It's very difficult for me to explain why the government does what it does. So as an epidemiologist, there are two things that testing should achieve. The first is getting a prevalence for antibodies. We want to know how wide is immunity already? How many people are already immune? That's very important for the epidemiology. And the other thing is, we want to know the sequence so that we know at what point in time did which mutations happen, and what is the characteristic of the virus that is now spreading a lot, and what are the characteristics of the virus that are not spreading anymore. And that has nothing to do, and that's again the difference between the virologist and the epidemiologist. The virologist is interested in the function. Do we have a change in a protein that is in the binding domain, which could potentially increase or decrease the likelihood of the virus to bind to a cell? I'm much more concerned with, do we have changes in the stretches of the genome that the cells put up there for recognition with antibodies so that the killer cells can come and eliminate the infected cell? And for the first part, with the binding, the function is very important. For the second one, it's just about identifying, is that cell infected or not? The function is irrelevant.
Okay. There's a question here by John Curley. Is John still here?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, John. I was repeating from a previous question from Cranium Up, who has thoughts about nutrition and COVID. I'd like to see how those merge.
I think with regular nutrition, I haven't seen much data that show that this has a major impact. There is a link, and that is that the strategy that we at Asdera try to employ is to develop a strategy that uses specific nutritional compounds that are known from use from decades in nutrients in food, so that we know their safety and that we know that this is something people could take for weeks or months, even if they don't know if they're going to get the disease. So that if you take something that is known for its safety from use in food, then you know that you have a very low risk of adverse events.
Deverell, I see you have a question here. I can't really summarize it. Why don't you ask it here?
I'm sorry, which question? I've posted a few.
Well, you were talking here about the virus. You've not read anything about this virus being
Okay, yes. I have yet to find any data that confirms that the virus has actually even been isolated. And so I don't understand how the vaccine can accurately target the virus when what my husband corrected me and said it's not NIH, but the report that I originally read was NIH, but he says the assertion is from CDC that they were only able to ever isolate 37 pairs out of 30,000 plus pairs of the virus's genome. And then they used computer modeling for the balance. So does that not mean the vaccine is based on theory largely? Because, I mean, if you only have 37 pairs out of over 30,000, isn't that an enormous amount of worrisome extrapolation?
I don't know where this number of 37 comes from. We know that in Spain, in the UK, thousands of genomes of the viruses have completely sequenced. So we know, and that's why we have all these phylogenetic trees that tell us when the first time a particular mutation happened, and we're seeing, and which of these mutations persisted and which mutations did not. So we have had thousands of complete genomes of the virus sequenced. So I'm not quite sure where, and I've seen the data, so I don't know where your assumption comes from.
This was an NIH study that I read that described the development of the PCR assay as an accurate test to identify and diagnose the virus, and that they did not have, they disclosed in the first paragraph that they did not have a sample of the virus. And so they used this, just the basic SARS virus, and they were able to actually extract, identify, capture 37 pairs of that base genome out of 30,000 plus, and that they computer modeled the rest of it, literally.
Okay, I don't know which particular publication you are referring to, so I cannot respond to it.
Understood.
Okay, there's a question here from Costa about vaccines and mutations. Gil Costa.
You should just read it.
Okay. Let me, it's hard. We have so many questions here. It's easy to get lost. I've lost it now. There's just rows of questions here. I want everybody to get their question answered. Yeah, I think there was a question here from Ed Hughes. Ed, I see you're here asking about deaths.
Well, yeah. Hi, John. Thanks. I mean, I think that there's a scientific issue about how does the virus behave and what's the proper vaccination or medical preventive practice. There's a social economic aspect, which is, do we close down schools? Do we close down businesses? How far do we want to go? There's an underlying philosophical argument to all this thing, and that is, if in fact you believe in herd immunity, and I want to state clearly that I think that is a wonderful hypothesis, but it is not a scientifically proven theory, right? We believe in that there might be something like herd immunity, but there hasn't been a provable set of verifiable tests that have been conducted to prove that in fact it's the case. But that's not my point. My point is, at what point, assuming that it is valid and that we should avoid lockdowns, either of schools or anything else, I think we can all agree that there's going to be a certain level of death resulting from it. A certain number of people are going to die that are either susceptible, older, that will die. What is the acceptable number of deaths that we would be willing to bear in order to keep the economy alive?
Okay, it's very difficult to answer. I will try to answer the question, but long questions are always difficult to answer. The assertion that we have no evidence for herd immunity is something I cannot follow. This season alone, we had 3 respiratory virus disease epidemics. The first was influenza B, the second was influenza A, and the third was COVID. Influenza B and influenza A ended after a couple of weeks. a month, whatever. What else but herd immunity would have ended these epidemics? There were no lockdowns, there were no masks, there was nothing. What else ended these two epidemics as the 200 in the last 100 years we had before?
As I said, I don't want to get into.
Tell
this.
me, what ended these epidemics?
Well,
It was not nature's normal way of end epidemics, and that is herd immunity.
Our questions that are based in what else but aren't evidence. They are essentially the absence of evidence trying to make the absence of evidence prove a fact, which isn't the case. Look, there are flu vaccines out there. Flu still takes 70,000 or so people's lives in the United States alone. We don't know how prevalent it is around the world. There are epidemics, they're not pandemic. I mean, there are all sorts of issues there that the question is really more philosophical in nature, and that is assuming.
It's not philosophical that all epidemics end after a couple of weeks.
Well, no, I mean,
smallpox
and measles.
We're talking about respiratory disease viruses and not about measles and not about smallpox and not about HIV. Different viruses have very different characteristics. We are talking about respiratory disease viruses here.
So the philosophical question that I had, and I'm going to try to make it brief, is assuming that we can reach herd immunity, we would have to be willing to bear a certain number of deaths in order to preserve the economy. What is that number? What is the level of mortality that we are willing to bear in order to save the economy? That's my question.
Okay, we have with every flu season, we have 25,000 to 65,000 deaths in the United States from respiratory virus diseases, and we're accepting that.
Yeah, but we're at over 300,000, and the estimate is it will be 600,000.
Yeah, because of the interventions that increased the number of deaths.
Yeah, but that's the post hoc ergo propter hoc argument again, which is really a defective arguing technique. It is how many? Give me just a philosophical answer to.
There are more deaths caused by the lockdown
than by the virus. Yes.
Yeah, there are many more. There's deaths of despair from depression, suicide, people not getting heart attacks, people not getting the regular care. There are many more caused by the lockdown.
There were the infectious seniors sent into the hospitals, and there's now the new epidemic that we would not have had without the lockdowns.
Okay, so what is the, assuming that you would need 60% infection rate in order to develop herd immunity. Would you agree with that? Where do you put the infection rate to at herd immunity?
Okay, we have a respiratory virus disease that has a basic reproduction number of about 2. With a basic reproduction number of about 2, you need 50% of people being immune for herd immunity.
And what percentage of the people that are infected would die as a result of the infection?
Can you just let me finish the sentence? Because if I cannot make an argument, we don't have a discussion. Would you agree that I actually make my sentence?
Go ahead, Knut. Just answer.
We need 50% of people to be immune. 25% of people are already immune from cross immunity. So we need about 25% of people to become infected. The infection fatality rate is something like 0.1%. Now you can do the math. It's not a lot. It's within the range that we have here, that we're talking about.
So you're talking about 800,000 people dying?
No, no way. I don't know what your math is. I'm using the decimal system and multiplication and addition.
But I think the debate is not over let it rip. The debate is over, or the debate is not over whether to mitigate or not to mitigate. The debate is over selective versus universal mitigation.
So there is no protect as many of the vulnerable and elderly as possible to reduce death, and instead let the virus run its natural course among the young and healthy, where we have very few, if any, death. So this is the strategy to reduce the number of deaths, is to direct the virus away from the vulnerable to the healthy and young.
And you're you said, and we put that in the invitation, that you think that 3 times more people are going to die from the mitigation.
In this epidemic, so
this,
far,
from
3
March
times
to
as
March.
many people died from the lockdowns than from the virus.
So it's not a debate about how many people should die. It's about what's the most effective way to reduce. No one wants anyone to die. The question is how to get the least number of people killed from this, how to defeat it, the most effective way to defeat it.
We cannot avoid each and every death. Every strategy that aims at doing that is causing even more death.
So you might address, because there's some confusion about how there's a trade-off between mitigate. In other words, the more you mitigate with universal mitigation and close the schools and the economy, your argument is that puts the not only does that lead to more deaths, it puts the unhealthy at risk. Right? That's your argument.
I mean, let's use masks here just as one example. And let's presume masks are working. We want the vulnerable and the elderly to protect themselves, to self-isolate, and wearing a mask with one of these strategies, while the virus is running through the population of the healthy and young. If instead everybody would do the same thing, the virus would affect the vulnerable and as much as the low-risk people. And that means a lot more of the vulnerable would become infected and die, while among the low-risk people, the same number of people would not become infected, but the difference in deaths would be unrecognizable. So if we do not protect those who are the most vulnerable, and if we take away the advantage they have from self-isolating by isolating everybody else as well, we're increasing the number of deaths. And this is what we have seen in this epidemic.
Ralph Gomery, I see your, Max, can you unmute Ralph? Maybe Ralph has muted himself. Max?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead,
Sorry.
Ralph.
I just want to stress the importance of what you're doing in having this meeting. Because a dissenting view from what the government is doing is trying to be shut down. And it's a very striking example, 2 striking examples of that. One, the tremendous public attacks on John Ioannidis, who is a a world famous scientist about debunking what we are doing, right? And the Washington Post article, again, about how this is, let's see, did I say this already? That YouTube will no longer carry any information, this is their policy, that is contradictory to what the World Trade, the World Health, WHO agrees to. That incredible censorship. Nothing can be said on YouTube now that contradicts what WHO agrees to. So that views such as you are allowing here are having a very tough time, right?
Right.
So I
And Dr.
congratulate.
And I would like to add something here.
Yeah.
The WHO earlier this year shared the opinion or the view, shared the view that there are two strategies to develop herd immunity. One is natural immunity from infection, and the other is immunity from vaccination. And in the end, it doesn't matter how people developed immunity, as long as there is, in this case, 50% people are immune, you have herd immunity. And November, they changed their position and says, herd immunity can only be developed with vaccination. So if there's no vaccination, the diseases run forever. So we have still all epidemics, all respiratory disease epidemics that were ever seen, the 200 of them in the last 100 years, where we didn't have a vaccine. They're still running at the highest possible level. Does that make any sense? No. The WHO is just a political body that issues often very nonsensical statements like this one, that goes against everything you can read in any textbook. But now on YouTube, you cannot go by textbooks. You cannot do science anymore. You have to follow the WHO.
Right, and so to make disclosure here, I saw interview you did back in the spring. I forgot whether it was March or April, and you got
It was early in April.
early in
After
April.
the
You got
publication I made in late March.
huge amount. I don't know how many hits were.
2 million.
2 million, and you were taken down.
Yes.
And if we put this this salon on YouTube, will probably be taken down.
Yes.
Yeah. If I could say, John, it's our version of the index of forbidden books in the Middle Ages up to the 1900s. The index wasn't a very useful vehicle for discovering truth. And I think we're underestimating all of the political and economic forces against protecting the status quo. There's huge amounts of money involved in the vaccines and the infrastructure, NIH. The politicians also would be the last ones to discover that they wasted hundreds of billions of dollars on warp speed that accomplished relatively nothing. And this is a problem that infects more than just this particular COVID-19. It happens all the time, and it warps the debate, which is what we're seeing today. Now, Knut, I think we still don't have all the data. I think he'd be the first one to say, let the views follow the data, not vice versa. And there's new information that comes in every day. We'll get more information on the vaccines. But we are, as a society now, given the mammoth size of the government and the industries that are dependent upon government favors to squelch healthy scientific or even-handed debate, because there's too much to be lost on those who need to defend the status quo. And that's why I think the committee is so invaluable, because we want a platform that lets all the audience decide for themselves. We're not trying to squelch the speech of the government or opposite viewpoints, but we know the other side is trying to do that because they want money and the power.
Diana?
So Bill Gates funds the WHO. He gives them a lot of money. He has a huge amount of control there. And Gates and Fauci also have financial interest in the Moderna vaccine. And Moderna never made a vaccine before, and they were $1.5 billion in debt, and Bill Gates bailed them out. And Fauci gave them $468 million in research for the vaccine. And there are also doctors whose licenses are being suspended, like Dr. Paul Thomas, who's a pediatrician. He wrote an article about children in his practice, comparing unvaccinated and vaccinated, and children who are unvaccinated have lower levels of ear infections and other things like that. Anyway, so after he published the article, they suspended his license. So yes, I appreciate this very much. And there's a lot of financial vested interest and profit and control.
The committee goes where the silence is loudest, and but I dare say, we would say that it's commonly known that the military industrial complex has 2 lobbyists for every congressman, and the too big to fail banks have 5. Now, does that mean that the banks are strong, weaker, that they need more lobbyists to get the same result, or what? But the crony capitalism, whether you wrap it in the flag or it's naked with the banks, I don't think any of our salons, because we've been at the Metropolitan Club, we haven't, and the rules are against filming things. We've been forced online here through because of the COVID. I don't think we would be taken down on YouTube for opposing the 9 unconstitutional presidential wars, or having speakers, question the impact of the, too big to fail banks, with the havoc they've wreaked on our economy. So the question is, it raises then, is Big Pharma, bought the 2 political parties on a scale that exceeds the subjects that we've been focusing on, and it's certainly a question that we're knocking around. I don't know what we'll do if we're taken down on Facebook. We'll have to have a discussion about that.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the High Wire, Del Bigtree, but he was taken down and he has his own platform now. So you could look up the High Wire.
It may be, John, that the difference is that the pharma is more frightened. The big banks and the military industrial complex have so much, a few dissenting views. When you get $1 trillion and 90% of the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, they don't care, because they have a lock on what the government's going to do anyway. Big pharma may be more fearful, and therefore needs to be more aggressive in publishing its index of forbidden books.
Joe, Nell Baldacchino, I see that you had something up on chat, which many things here I can't.
Yeah, John, I have a couple of questions. I'm a little hesitant to ask them because they're more general and scientific, and you guys have been getting more specific. But maybe they'll shed some light. This is based on things I just heard Knut say, and I have questions to see if I'm understanding them correct. The first question I have is herd immunity. I gather, okay, I'm in my 70s. I have comorbidities, I've been locking myself down regardless of whatever everybody else does. I don't know whether the restaurant's open or not because I'm not going out to find out. But when herd immunity comes, I guess if I run into somebody and I come in close contact while they are infected, then I can catch it. Herd immunity means that a good percentage of the population now have developed antibodies and they're not going to be actively infected. Does that simply mean I'm less likely to run into somebody who is actively infected? And that's what, but I could still, I mean, there might be only 5 people left who's active in the whole country. If I run into them, I could still get it. But somehow the odds get that you're not likely to run into an infected person if enough of it is spread. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the next thing,
Joe, let's stop right there. And Knut, why don't you do the math? Because I don't, Mike Telson went through those numbers. If you kind of walk through the numbers, 100 people in the room, all that, so that people get it out of this concept and put it into numbers, what herd immunity means.
Herd immunity just means if somebody enters the population being infectious, there would be only less than one other person on the average would become infected by this person and become infectious. So that every chain of infection ends after a very short chain. And that means, in effect, the epidemic is over. And eventually, then the last viruses that exist simply vanish. And that is what herd immunity does. But it's not, it's just a state that an epidemic reaches either through people becoming infected or people becoming vaccinated, where somebody who enters the population meets mostly people who are already immune and therefore cannot spread this any further.
But Joe's question was that if it's 50% and he's out there and he meets that infected person, what does he do in terms of his personal mitigation strategy? If he's got serious comorbidities.
One thing that he should do is to take preventive action to prepare his body to lower the effect of comorbidities and to reduce the spread of viruses once he becomes infected. And if that strategy succeeds, then when he gets infected, in the end, it will be as inconsequential as with somebody who's young and healthy.
I have another general question that I think kind of might help explain or just clarify some of what you've already said. And that is, what I pick up is the way this works. The virus, if you get infected, the virus starts trying to bind to some of your own body's cells, and it spreads from cell to cell.
Yes.
If you are a young, healthy person, and that starts to happen, your body rather quickly starts developing antibodies, and it goes after the cells that have already been infected. It hits them one at a time, and it tries to shut all that spread down. And if it happens real quickly, the cells of your body that get attacked is a very small number. And so you don't feel, what's that?
It's the same in a young person and in you. But at the end, if if the immune system has created antibodies, it's killing a large number of cells. That's a bad thing. And the young person will survive that and you may not.
Okay. So
in other words, it's the immune system that's actually killing you then, right? Because You get this, if you've got all these cells that are infected and the antibodies come and attach to the antigens, which is the little piece of RNA on the outside of the cell, and then the killer T cells come and kill the cell, and you've got, you know, a humongous amount of these cells. You have a huge wound, and the wound is what sets you up for, you know, where obesity or your heart condition or diabetes, these other things, you know, take you out. It's the wound, and it's actually the immune system that is creating the wound. And let me put it another way. Would you be better off having just all those virus cells in you without having them killed, having the killer T cells knock off the cells? Would you survive better?
I don't get the question.
Well, in other words, you're talking about the size of the wound by the number of cells that are infected, right? And Joe was asking you to explain that.
Yeah, if I could ask a little more, just to try to clarify. See, I thought that when the immune system starts to try to slow the spread of the virus within you, it goes after all the infected cells, and when it shuts those down, it quits spreading because there's no more infection there. And so I thought if it happened quickly and then the infection is stopped and you have antibodies in you, so you're kind of immune for the future. And that's the way it works. Whereas if you were an old comorbid person, it's attacking your cells or going after your cells, but the infection lasts long. You know, it spreads more, is what I thought.
The process is very much the same in an old and in a young person. It is just once the immune system kills all infected cells, a young person survives that wound. An old person might die of that wound.
The same wound, the same number of cells. In other words,
What if you're taking like high doses of vitamin C or ozone therapy or something like that, or D?
It's probably not killing you.
Right.
Another question.
We have no evidence that it does much good.
so Knut, what she's trying to get at, and explain this, that it's not the immune system needs strengthening, right? That's a common thing. We need to strengthen our immune system. You're saying the immune system is strong enough. It does the job, right? You need something else. It's not a stronger immune system you need, but what?
So I just have to, my computer tells me I have to go somewhere where I have an outlet. So give me 2 minutes.
Okay.
I have to put this computer into an outlet.
Okay.
Because otherwise I'm running out of batteries.
Okay. Bob Randolph, are you with us here? Bob, you had a question I lost here on the chat.
John?
Yes.
I had a question many moons ago.
Okay.
But as I understand, Dr. Wittkowski, that it's mitigation, which includes mass lockdowns and isolation, which creates the conditions where the virus can mutate and escape.
Yes.
And I'm sort of I think I understand the concept of herd immunity. It's really 50+1, maybe. And then, or then it basically squeezes out the non-immune. Is that the way it works?
I'm not, say it again, I'm not quite following.
You want to get to 50% and then 50 plus 1.
We want to get to 50%.
Ultimately, it kind of squeezes the vulnerable out of the tube in some sense.
You want to let the vulnerable self-isolate
Yeah.
while virus is spreading.
Yeah.
And once you have herd immunity, they can come back, and the risk of then getting infected is virtually nil.
Right. Maybe that was the wrong way of putting it. You want to squeeze the virus out of the tube, which you do by self-isolating the vulnerable and letting it run.
It may, I don't see the image. I have that problem with John all the time, that I think structurally and he thinks in examples, and I don't get his examples. And we may have one of those examples here.
Yes, you do. John's the exemplar who's infected all the rest of us. Thank you. But thank you very much, Dr. Wittkowski.
Good. So, yeah, Joe, you didn't think, yeah, get back in here, Joe. What's your question?
Well, okay, so if I run into somebody who's infected and then I start to get infected and my body produces antibodies, but if I'm a weak old guy, it might do a lot of damage and kill me. I'm curious how, if instead of I develop antibodies because I ran into somebody who's infected, instead I get antibodies because I've got a vaccine, how is that less likely to hurt me since I'm old and weak than if I get it from somebody who's actively infected? Each case you've got antibodies coming into play, but in one case I'm harmed because of the infection that I ran into. But if I get the antibodies from the vaccine, it's less likely to damage me. Why is that?
That's what we hope for, yes. We don't have seen a lot of studies of the vaccines in the elderly and those with comorbidities. So we don't have, I would like to see more of those. But the idea is that the vaccination would get you to the point of immunity where you do not have to go through the spread of the virus in your body. The alternative that I am proposing is to prepare your body to give less support to the virus for spreading, so that in the end you would have fewer viruses and you wouldn't have such a huge wound.
But Dr. Wittkowski, excuse me, but I think we all want to know how to prepare our bodies. And I think you've given short shrift to nutrition. And maybe you're saying get a lot of sleep, get outside and exercise. What do we do to prepare our bodies?
We have developed a strategy. Now I'm talking pro domo, so you should take all of that with a grain of salt. We have identified, wait a second, still not getting power here. Wait a second. We have identified nutritional components who, when taken together on a regular basis, would prepare your body by first reducing comorbidities, and that is obesity, that is type 2 diabetes, that are cardiovascular risk factors like high LDL and low HDL, but that would also prevent your cells to allow the viruses to replicate too fast. So you're taking away the capacity that cells would otherwise lend to the virus, and that would let the virus replicate more slowly. And if the virus replicates 10% slower with each of the replication cycles during the incubation period, you would have 80 to 90% less infected cells, and therefore a much smaller wound.
What about with getting zinc into the cells with hydrochloroquine, the Zelenko?
Having a sufficient amount of zinc definitely wouldn't hurt. I have no problem with that. That might help. I would not take a drug like hydrochloroquine. The major action of hydrochloroquine is to stop autophagy. That is the detoxification of cells. This is what it's actually approved for in the United States. And if you're stopping the detoxification of your cells for more than just a few days, then you have a higher risk of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and similar diseases. So taking hydrochloroquine for a long period of time is something that I would not do.
Okay, thanks. Good to know. I didn't know.
I see Richard Squires here. Richard, do you have a question? Is Richard muted? I see Ryan Vigory. Ryan, are you there? Joe, I don't know if we answered you had
Well,
whether we.
I think you've answered the questions I had, but I have one quick one. The product that Dr. Wittkowski is talking about that's in development, does it work primarily, is it a combination of nutritional factors, or is it a
Yes.
drug, or is it both?
It's a combination of nutritional factors that are formulated so that the two compounds always stay together and are not being separated, so that you have the synergistic effect all the time.
When will it be available?
As soon as I find a commercial partner to bring it to the market.
And what are the compounds?
Pardon?
What are the compounds?
The compound comprises of alpha-cyclodextrin, which is a type of fiber that is capable of collecting lipids in serum, and capric acid, which is one of the fatty acids that's in milk, in breast milk, and also in coconut oil. And that capric acid would allow the alpha-cyclodextrin to get into the bloodstream and collect the lipids there. And collecting lipids and the phospholipids in the bloodstream reduces the endocytosis that cells need to hitchhike to get into the cells. So it makes it more difficult for viruses to get incorporated into cells.
Okay. Thanks.
So it would avoid it wouldn't matter whether where a vaccine is very specific to a particular part of the receptor. This would be a generic preventive. It's a very different mechanism of action. Very different.
I would say vaccines have the disadvantage that they're being designed to target one particular virus. And if that virus mutates in these 6 regions where the antibodies bind, or whatever the number is, if there is a new strain of the virus, the vaccine may not work anymore. The strategy that we are pursuing is to reduce the replication of whatever virus happens to be around. And so it would work as well for a new strain as for the old strain.
So that would
there
be
would
true.
be no way to develop resistance.
So that would be true of influenza. Any flu is either rhino or coronavirus. It would be true of all respiratory viruses. Right. Dan Morgan, I see you've been here. Dan, do you have a question? Okay. Do we have? There's.
Ends unmuting.
John?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, there was a simple question, which there was a discussion about this earlier now, but my question was simply somewhat similar to that series of questions about the mortality rate under Knut's program of no mitigation, no masks, but maximum protection for the elderly and vulnerable, what would the mortality, what would that do to the mortality rate?
It would be substantially lower than what it is right now.
Because
the vulnerable would have the full benefit of protection, and very few of them would die. And of the others, very few die anyway.
So Dan, if you
don't
die,
have a number, you don't have a number. It would be a very small number, but you don't have a number or a rough estimate. In the United States, with a population of 330 million or so.
Right, I don't want to pull a number out of my head right now. But if you send me an email, I'll be happy to do that. But it's very difficult if you are on the spot to come up with the correct numbers. And I have learned sometimes I give a number that is a bit off, and I don't want to do that again.
Well, thank you.
good. Yeah. So Dan, if you die, you're not going to contribute to herd immunity. So every old person that dies does not get us to herd immunity. So that's the that's the fact lurking here.
Yeah, I think, John, in terms of numbers, what we had spoken of before, and I don't want to put anything in Knut's mouth, that if you confine the mitigation to vulnerable, they would die at a rate of only 1/4 of what they're dying at now. And the healthy population death rate would stay basically the same, which is de minimis. But that's the order of magnitude of deaths foregone. 3/4 of the elderly would live with the limited mitigation that would die with the uniform comprehensive mitigation.
My only final question, which relates to that, was that haven't we been kind of doing that in terms of protecting the elderly? I mean,
no.
Someone made the point.
Unfortunately not.
Someone made the point that they don't go to restaurants and haven't been to a restaurant for 8 months, and that would apply to me as well. So, you know, there's been a good deal of that, yet we still have, you know, a very high rate of death for the elderly.
Well, one of the most
in my zip code, people, 1 out of 4 die who are over 80 and contract the disease.
Well, the first thing was that the governor sent infectious seniors into the nursing homes so that they could infect the other seniors. That contributed to 40%, according to the CDC, to 40% of all deaths in the US. The other thing is mitigation prolongs the time. So even if you don't go out that often, if the whole thing takes 10 months rather than 2, your risk is 5 times as high.
Yeah. And I think the other point that you had made, Knut, is that when you do, Dan, the universal mitigation, you deny an advantage to the vulnerable. So that if you keep the mitigation to the vulnerable, the virus will spread amongst the healthy and not kill anyone, although they may get infected. And the reason why you're having more deaths amongst the elderly with universal mitigation is that you lose that competitive advantage, if you will, in pushing the virus where people are unprotected, but they're young and healthy. And that's why the death rate is higher than it would be with limited mitigation confined to the vulnerable.
Agreed.
Good. Do we have any more questions? There's so many on this chat thing that it's hard to. I've lost the thread here. Is anyone else getting to the witching hour here?
I have one, John.
Good, Pat.
Just one. I don't want to be long, but the young people who go to the school, say the 7, 8, 9-year-olds, do they actually get the virus? And if so, could they, if they come home from the school and they're with their elderly grandparents, can they transmit that virus to the elderly grandparents?
They get infected. Typically, they have only a relatively low viral load. They're unlikely to transmit. If there is a 3-generation household, something that I haven't seen in Manhattan, but in other parts of the country that may be, then it may be helpful during the time where a virus is circulating to keep the grandchildren and the grandparents in different rooms most of the time. Or to wear a mask when they get together.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Well, Knut, we really appreciate the time you've given us, and you've given us a lot to think about. The next salon we're going to be looking for a speaker to come in and articulate the universal mitigation strategy that we've experienced, and deal with a number of the questions that you've raised about mutation pressure and so forth. And we'll have a list of those. But we're very open to, we'd like everyone here to send us in names, and we'll get a group together and go through them all and try to pick a speaker who can give the other give counter arguments to the very provocative points that Knut has raised.
Yeah, I would just add, John, I think the program has been a spectacular. I think it's what free speech is supposed to be about. No shouting, exchange of views, new views that perhaps raise questions that hadn't been thought about before, but no ultimatums, no speaking gospel. And this is how we're going to be wiser in treating not only this pandemic, but in future ones as well, to try to ensure at the beginning that there's a welcome mat for all different viewpoints. So the likelihood of arriving at the most successful approach is at its zenith, rather than censoring anything that runs against the financial and political power in the status quo.
Good. Well, thank you very much to everybody. It was a very good discussion. Appreciate it. And we'll
thank you.
We'll be back.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dr. Knut. Yeah, very, very helpful.
Thank you, Knut.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good job, John. Thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wittkowski. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And John, provocative, wonderful.
Thank you and Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.